Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. I received a few questions or a few comments on my last video that a couple of which I think I responded to, but then I had a couple from Margaret. I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce your name, Pinard. I know I follow your channel as well, but you had a couple of things to say when I was discussing the book From England to France, and I actually pulled it up from where I was storing it downstairs, by William Chester Jordan. I did this review, I want to say, a week or two ago, and you had a comment specifically about the aspect of trial by, the different kinds of trial bys, the trial by fire, trial by water, and you had mentioned trial by water in particular. And your question was whether that was just having to do with whether or not you just float or you drown or whatever. It had a little bit more going into that. And when it talks about the two kinds of trial by water. And I actually marked the part where it discusses it because I had remembered this, but I wanted to double check. So there were the most famous types of ordeal were those of hot iron, hot water, and cold water. Cold water is the one that everybody thinks of with the Monty Python skit. She's afloat, she's a witch, she floats, that kind of thing. That's what we usually think of as the cold water one. The one of hot iron and hot water are very similar insofar as you either grasp the hot iron, hold it for a certain amount of time, and then they will wrap the hand and see how the wound heals. And if you heal well, that is a sign that you've been favored by God, and that proves your innocence. Same thing with the trial by hot water. And it says specifically, it's a 3-day wait when they had wrapped the hands. At the expiration of the waiting period, then they would remove the bandages, examine the hands, and the hands beginning to heal, evidence innocence, like I just stated. So then with the ordeal of hot water, followed a similar procedure after the accused retrieved the stone from the cauldron. So a stone would be placed into a cauldron of hot water. So then they would hold that stone from the cauldron of hot water for a specified amount of time. Once that was done, wrap the hands in 3 days, see if healing has begun. I mean, heaven forbid if you had diabetes or something, you just didn't heal well. I guess then you were, guilty. Of course, I'm not sure how common diabetes was back then. They don't have the same kind of, it's not the same diet there's not the same diet we have now to cause more of an upsurge in type 2 diabetes that you might have even seen in the Tudor time, where you see more sugar intake. The diets just weren't the same. Now, type 1 diabetes, that's a whole different matter, but that's my other one of my niche interests in history that have nothing to do with this topic. So yes, that's the hot water, which is, like I said, very similar to the ordeal of hot iron. Now, when they're talking about the one for cold water, which is the one that everyone thinks of with the floating or drowning, like the Monty Python skit, if she floats, she's stuck. No, that means she's a witch. Well, it actually had more to do with how much the person struggled. So what they say here is, in the ordeal of cold water, the accused was immersed in the pool. So far, so good. We know this part. Sinking implied innocence. The holy water received the accused. Floating implied guilt. Presumably, the fear incumbent on a guilty conscience, dreading the judgment of God, was being revealed in a desperate desire not to drown. In any case, the victim, whether showing signs of calm confidence entering the water or evidenced terror and trying to thrash, was removed from the pit before any serious physical harm could be done. The guilty were liable to mutilation or execution. So what it sounds like is that your guilt or innocence was more or less declared by how you reacted to being immersed in this pool of water. So if you were freaking out, they assumed that you were, oh, well, you believe that, you're guilty. You believe that you're dreading the judgment of God. And if you didn't thrash, then you trusted that God would save you in spite of you sinking. Now, I think that it's really interesting that going together, you have if you're innocent, you'll sink, but don't you thrash. But if you're guilty, you'll float because the water doesn't accept the guilty. But if you thrash, then obviously you're afraid, you're guilty because you're afraid that you will sink. So it's just an interesting way the medieval mind worked in a sort of, if you kind of twist your head a little bit, you can see how that might work into their logic with the idea of the guilty conscience. But yeah, I think that's very interesting that usually they did not get to the point where you would actually drown. You would be killed in other ways for your execution. But drowning, unless that was, well, they believed that the water wouldn't accept the guilty. So I guess drowning was not going to be the way you were killed. But yes, I thought that it was an interesting thing to bring up because I think that a lot of our knowledge about the trial by water specifically is very much formed by what is presented to us through other media, more popular media like a Monty Python, where we see it as, does that just mean that you don't drown? Or does that, how does that even work? It's almost, the more detail of what went into their logic, I don't think gets touched on a lot. And this book does touch on it. There's a lot in this book that was very interesting. It's not an area usually, I have an interest in medieval English history, but I picked this up kind of on a whim when I picked it up because it was a good sale and I was vaguely interested in the topic. And I'm really glad I did pick it up because it did explore some things that I hadn't really thought about or considered, gives another view of the medieval world while also explaining some things that are kind of in our collective consciousness, but things that we don't even necessarily understand correctly because what's in our collective consciousness isn't the full picture. So I just thought I'd share that because I thought that was an interesting topic. I wasn't sure, Margaret, that I could cover it in the detail that I wanted to, besides which I thought it would be more interesting to share in a video where other people could see this addressed as well and maybe be tempted to look farther into this book and jump in and expand, knowledge in a bit of a different area. As you had mentioned in one of your comments, a niche area, but an interesting area that does touch various aspects of medieval life, and it covers things that we kind of think we know about, but we don't necessarily. Like, we see the trials by fire, combat, water touched upon in all different sorts of media that look back at the past, and we see things like the fleur-de-lis addressed in Three Musketeers, but we don't necessarily, because we don't have the same cultural knowledge that was present then, that not everyone has that, we're missing a bit of the subtext, which this book provides. So I thought that was interesting. Now, the next part that I wanted to do is I wanted to do a bit of a video about my library card system. Although, maybe I'll make that a different video. I'll end this video, and then I'll do the video about the library card. I'm going to pull out some of the stuff while I have this one going, but I believe there was a question about my system. So I am going to move some of this stuff to the side, and then I'll end this video so I can at least access what I need while we're talking. But I will have that view so that way you guys be looking down at what I'm seeing myself, and then I'll probably take the camera in hand and actually show you even more detail what I'm looking at. Okay, so that's the end of this video. I have uncovered what I need to uncover, and I will be back.